Hi, this is Dr. Christopher Miller, and welcome to a lecture on Jain doctrine and karma theory. This will carefully follow Paul Dundas's book, The Jains, pages 86 through 111. As I often do when I begin these lectures, I'd like us to just take a moment to meditate on the image that is on the title card here. This image comes with a story that will help illustrate the Jain concept of karma theory in a way that will be helpful for the rest of the lecture. So here we see 6 men in a tree. What are they doing in this tree? Well, these 6 men were walking down the road and they were really hungry. They were all hungry and they saw this fruit tree. Each of them came up to the fruit tree and had a different way for approaching how they would get the fruit from the tree in order to satisfy their hunger. As we'll see, the way that each of them approaches this tree will dictate the color and severity of their karma in a way that illustrates Jain karma theory within the Jain tradition. So the first man comes up and he uproots the tree, or he suggests, let's uproot this tree and take it away and eat the fruit off of it. That's not a very nice thing to do, right? Because that will kill the tree, create a lot of violence both to the tree and to the earth around. No more fruit will grow. People won't be able to eat from the tree anymore. It's a very selfish thing to do. Well, this man has the darkest karma. He has black karma, according to the Jain tradition. And karma within Jainism is a substance. So it's an actual particle that is attached to his soul and is keeping him in bondage, okay? So the person with that darkest karma has the darkest particles attached to his soul. The next man says, no, we don't need to cut down the whole, or we don't need to rip the whole tree out. Let's just cut the tree down. And so this man, being a little bit less violent, because he's going to leave the stump, and maybe the stump will throw up some new shoots and maybe a new tree will grow and provide fruit in the future. He's a little bit less violent, so he has a little bit less darker karma. His karma is gray, so he has gray particles all attached to his soul, binding him to the earth. He's pretty far from liberation too. The next man comes along and says, we don't need to cut the whole tree down. Let's just cut the branches off and take the fruit with the branches. His karma, a little less severe, obviously, because the whole tree will still be there just without its branches, is blue. A little bit less dark, but dark nonetheless, and still binding him to this world and preventing him from liberation. The next man says, why don't we just pick off some of the smaller branches and just take some of the fruit with us. We don't need to take it all. Again, less violent. His karma is red. Still, though, not close to liberation. The next man, however, comes and says, I'm just going to pick fruit off the tree that I want to eat. So he starts to pluck the fruit off of the tree. That's not that violent, but it's still, harming the tree in the sense that you're pulling things off the tree prematurely before they fall. His karma is yellow. The last man comes along and says, I'm not even going to touch the tree. And as you see in the image here, there are pieces of fruit strewn around the ground. And he goes around and he picks up the fruit off the ground to eat that has already been given by the tree that will not cause any direct harm to the tree. His karma is white. He has the lightest karma. He's the closest to liberation, the most meritorious. And yet, nevertheless, he will also eventually have to even burn what is considered to be his good karma and all of his good intentions anyways. Now, one thing I also want to note about this is that although there is a color spectrum here of dark to light, we might get the idea that this is a racist sort of karmic ideology, and it's not. So I don't want us to go there, but I just want to bring it up to say that we're not referring to skin color here. We're referring to karmic particulate matter that is stuck to the soul by color, right? And the lighter your karma, the closer you are to liberation. So let's see how this story of karma theory and particulate matter sticking to the soul fits in with Jain doctrine and karma theory more broadly. That's what we'll do in this lecture. The topics that we'll look at are, we'll look at the Tattva Sutra. This is a text that we looked at before. We're going to revisit it. It's the one text that is canonical to all Jains and has a very deep description, not only of karma theory, but of the structure of the universe in general, which is what we'll look at in number 2 here, the second bullet point, the Jain Loka, or structure of the universe. How do Jains understand the universe to be constructed? Then we'll look at the 5 Jain ontological categories, known as dravya or astika. The dravya or astika are the 5 basic things that the whole universe is made out of. You have to know what these are if you're a Jain. And then we'll look at the Jain hierarchy of life, so how Jains hierarchize all the different life forms. We'll then look at the 9 tattvas, or what are known as reals. These are 9 other things that the entire universe is constructed of, that includes those 5 from before, the 5 Jain ontological categories, but adds up to 9. Then we'll look at Jain karma theory more broadly, and we'll conclude there and how it leads to, or not, to liberation, maybe rebirth. Remember, we're trying to escape rebirth. We have to burn all of our karma in this life, all that particulate matter off of our body, off of our soul, so that we can be liberated in the Jain tradition. So just as a brief overview, as we often do at the beginning of these lectures as well, it's important to note, as Dundas does, that Jain doctrine was first concerned primarily with liberation. Again, everybody was trying to figure out how to get out of this cycle of death and rebirth. That was the primary preoccupation of Jain doctrine, and it had a lot to do with practice, how you burn that karma off, or how you live your life to perfect nonviolence, essentially, so that you will be liberated. Eventually, however, the Jain doctrine become objects of intense intellectual reflection, right? So there are other competing philosophies, and into India's classical period, and with the Sanskrit language, and with the Prakrit language, these various forms of intellectual reflection on Jain doctrine go beyond just the concern with liberation, but also go into trying to understand the structure of the universe and how one can be liberated from it. So liberation is still there, but there's a lot of scaffolding that goes around it in terms of trying to understand how liberation works within that scaffolding, within that structure, within those metaphysics of the universe. The basic metaphysical teachings, as Dundas points out, however, are never radically interpreted. Nonviolence remains the primary preoccupation of the ascetic, and the way that the universe is structured may become more elaborate, but the basic ways of getting out of it are never really change, or they remain fairly consistent across time and space. Stability comes again from this text known as the Tattva Sutra, which again you see pictured here to the right, and I highly recommend you download and read. It's a classical systemization of all of the Jain philosophy that had been scattered and put together up to that point in time. Acharya Umaswami, or sometimes called Umasvati, puts it all together in a systematic format, and all Jains consider this to be a canonical or authoritative text. So it's really, again, it's worth having. And a lot of what we're going to cover in this lecture comes from that text. So the Tattva Sutra, we've looked at this before, begins with the notion of 3 basic jewels, right? The 3 jewels of Jainism required as a foundation for eventually achieving liberation and enlightenment. As we said in the first lecture, to be a Jain, to have a Jain identity, or to identify as a Jain, means that you are fundamentally committed not only to the omniscience of the Tirthankaras, those great spiritual teachers, such as the one you see pictured here to the right, but also to these 3 basic jewels, which are 1, right faith, darshana. Darshana, again, comes from the verbal root darsh, which means to see. So it's not just faith, right? That's an English translation. It's not just belief, as Dundas points out, but it's a correct way of seeing reality, of seeing things, of viewing things that is in accordance with the Jain way of viewing reality, right? So there is a faith component to it, that you have faith in the Jain metaphysical and ontological teachings of the way that the universe is constructed and the way you're going to get out of it. But eventually, it's a way of seeing things through your own experience that this is actually true, right? So you have a commitment to the Jain view, the darshana, which is the first of the 3 jewels. The second is right knowledge, jnana. You have to know the complex nature of reality. So beyond just seeing it and believing in it, you have to know it for yourself. And you have to know it by studying reality carefully, according to the Jain philosophy and tradition, the way that it was passed down from the Tirthankaras and the philosophers. You have to understand this complex nature of reality in order to be liberated from it. So this is an important part of Jain doctrine, which basically says you have to understand and engage with and know the world before you can escape from it, right? That's not a universal Jain teaching, as we'll see. There are other more mystical teachings that go straight to the soul first and say, forget about the world and all that stuff. But generally speaking, you must know that the complex nature of reality before you can be liberated from it, right? And the Tattva Sutra is going to lay out that nature of reality. Third, you have to act in accordance to the nature of reality. So essentially, your behavior, your charitra, has to follow the insights of knowledge and faith and viewing reality according to the Jain tradition, which essentially means that you know nothing wants to be hurt, you know there's a hierarchy of life, you know you have to perfect nonviolence, you know you have to give up all your possessions and burn all your karma, act accordingly. And that's where all of the various ways that monks and nuns, as well as lay people, have to conduct themselves arises, all the rules and ideas, the charitra. If one is fully committed to and works their way through all of these things, there's the potential for enlightenment, as you see in the second bullet point, which essentially also means that you become omniscient, you become all-knowing of everything in the universe. One can know, as you see in the last bullet point, and see everything in the universe at all times and in all possible modifications. You just know everything, okay? That would be a pretty nice state to be in, wouldn't it be? And yet you're free from the universe at the same time. The universe is referred to as the Loka. Loka can translate as, for example, world. So it's the world in which we live, the cosmos in which we live, or open space, right? So the open space in which we live. And it might come from the verbal root, as Dundas points out, lok, to see. So the reason that's important is because it's also, it's a place at the top of the universe, the Loka. It can refer to the place at the top of the universe where liberated souls go when they actually achieve liberation. And from that perspective, that higher perspective, they see and they know everything, right? So the Loka could refer to that, but it also has two other basic meanings that are much more complex, and that's what we're going to go through right now. So to the right, this image, this is a portrayal, a contemporary portrayal of the Loka. At the very top, at the point that you see the little dot, that is where the liberated souls go. They go and they sit at the very top of the Loka, looking down. They're free from it. They're not in it, but they see it and they know everything that's going on within it. That's where the liberated souls will go. Right underneath there, you see 3 points. 1, 2, 3, 3 dots. Those represent the 3 jewels of Jainism that we just went over before. Below that, you see the swastika, right? And this is something that is commonly misinterpreted in Indian traditions in general, and specifically in the Jain tradition, because most of us are familiar with the swastika from Nazi Germany, Hitler, violence, right? All the awful things that the Nazis did in Germany. What Hitler did is he took this image, tried to tie himself back to the authority of the early Indian civilizations, right? And he inverted it, so he turned it slightly and gave it its own meaning. But within Jainism, it's an auspicious symbol, and I will tell you the meaning of it in a future lecture, but just suffice to say for now that it does not stand for violence. It does not stand for Hitler's Germany. Originally, it's a sign, it's a symbol with a very specific meaning within the Jain tradition that has to do with reincarnation and all the different ways that one can be born and perhaps even liberated. Okay, so think about it that way for now and just have that in mind, and we'll return to it in a future lecture. Below that, we have a hand holding up a symbol, and in it, in the center, it says ahimsa, nonviolence, right? So we're trying to perfect that nonviolence. And then below that, it says parasparo pagraho jivanam. Parasparo pagraho jivanam. And one really nice translation of this comes from Shugan Jain. Shugan runs the International School for Jain Studies, and I believe his translation is something like this. The function or purpose of souls, all of our jivas, right, our souls, is to help one another, right? What a beautiful rendition, what a beautiful phrase, right, in Sanskrit and English. So the purpose of souls is to help one another within this loka to eventually move up through the scale of life, perfect nonviolence, and achieve liberation. We're all here to help each other, right? So that is the loka very broadly. And I'm going to go through more detail of it as we move forward in this lecture, but this basic symbolism that you see here, that's what it stands for. And you can see that it's in the shape of a person's body almost, right? It's like a cosmic person. Just like in the Rig Veda for the Hindus, there's a cosmic person. This is sort of a cosmic person or cosmic body in which everything takes place, all experience. So the 2 meanings of the Loka, the 2 other basic meanings, as you see in bullet point number 3, are that it is a structure of heaven and hells as well as the earth. The earth is right in the middle, as we'll see. And it is also the place where at the top the liberated souls go. And the second other basic meaning is that Loka can refer to, the word Loka can refer to the 5 basic ontological categories that create the universe's structure. So we're first going to look at those 5 basic ontological categories. That's one of our topics to be covered in this lecture. And then we're going to move on and we'll look at the structure of heavens and hells that is actually within this Loka. So in order to achieve liberation, one of the things you have to do is you have to know these 5 ontological categories, because if you don't understand the nature of reality and the structure of reality. You don't have all of the proper prerequisite knowledge for attaining liberation. These 5 ontological categories in Sanskrit are referred to as dravya, which can mean substance, or astikaya. Okay, so these are the basic building blocks, as you see in bullet point number 1, of all of existence. So everything that exists can basically be boiled down to these 5 things, right? What's the most important of those 5 things? It is the jiva, the soul, our self, our higher self, right? It's translated as a life monad, okay? According to Dundas, right? Each of us has one of these life monads within us, right? It experiences things and so on and so forth. If you look to the image to the right, at the center of this image, that white space is that empty space for the soul. That's the soul. It's the life monad. It's encased within this body because of karma, as we'll see. And our job here is to liberate it, or to make it realize it's free, it's eternal, it's pure consciousness, right? And as you see in bullet point number 2, under the jiva, it has 3 qualities. It has the qualities of bliss, energy, and omniscience. However, those 3 qualities are obscured by our karma, and that is why we must work through our karma in order to alleviate those particular things, in order to experience these particular things. Okay, the soul can be known through knowledge, jnana, which we talked about before. So through knowledge of the universe comes knowledge of the self, right? The self is everything that the universe is not, but in order to understand that, you have to first understand what the universe is, and that will give you liberation, freedom, and that will liberate your soul. Now, we talked about before how Jainism, or the Jain tradition, is often referred to as an atheistic tradition, in that it has no ultimate God, right? There are demigods and so on within stories and cosmologies and so on and so forth, but there's no ultimate creator God as there would be, for example, in the Abrahamic traditions. Instead, there is only the self, the jiva, number 1, the first of these 5 ontological categories. Sometimes, however, Jains will describe the jiva, as Dundas points out, as the paramatman, which means the highest self, right? And that highest self, paramatman, could be something almost akin to God, as a potential state of divinity that is within each and every one of us. So we each have this divine possibility, or this divine potentiality within us in our jiva, at our deepest, most subtle aspect of ourself, right? And that's something akin to divinity or God, but it's not God in the sense that we think of God in Hindu traditions as some ultimate Godhead, or in Christian traditions or Abrahamic traditions in general, okay? It's distinct, yet they have this thing called paramatman, which is synonymous with the jiva. That's something like that. It's the highest self, paramatman, the greatest self within each and every one of us. It has a will, okay? So the soul has a will and it acts, but it doesn't have form, and it needs form because it's pure consciousness. It's just eternal pure consciousness. It needs form and structure in order to act out the will and to experience life and ultimately to be liberated. So it's a bit of a paradox. It's ensnared in this body and it must be liberated, but it requires, and it depends on the body and the world in order to be liberated, right? So how does that all pan out? Well, the remaining 4 ontological categories help explain how the soul becomes encased in bodies, human or otherwise, and how it eventually can be liberated. And that happens through the following 4 things. Okay, so if number 1 is the jiva, the soul, numbers 2 through 5 that you see listed here on this slide are the jiva. As you see to the right of the slide, it says jiva, not soul. Anytime you put an a in front of a Sanskrit word, it negates that word. So this is stuff that is not the soul. It's everything else that is not soul, not the self. Okay. There's first, number 2, pudgala, and these are atoms. Okay, so think of them, it's translated as atoms, but this is the particulate matter that will adhere to the soul depending on which kind of body you're born into, according to your karma. Okay, these atoms here, these atoms provide the body for the jiva. They accumulate according to my karma, your karma, an animal's karma, a plant's karma, to create a body for the jiva, right? So that's the very material, this is the materiality of life. Number 3, the third basic ontological category is dharma. Okay, we've seen dharma before. Dharma in Hindu traditions can mean one's duty or responsibility according to the caste or class that they are born into. So like if you're born into the priestly class, you have to be a priest. If you're born into the warrior caste, you have to be, or class, you have to be a warrior. Here, dharma takes on a very specific meaning, and it means that which carries, as Dundas says. It means motion. Okay, so all it means is that things in the world, in the universe, can move, right? They become encased in atoms, then they have the potentiality to move, right? So souls can move within bodies, right? So my movement right now, this is dharma. This is it. It's motion, I'm moving. But then we also have the possibility for adharma, for inertia, for rest, for no movement, number 4. This creates the conditions, as Dundas points out, for stasis, right? So I'm not moving right now. And also stabilization of the mind in meditation. So while we have to move and do things to get on with life, we also at times, if you go to yoga or meditation or anything like that, we take a moment out to sit calmly and quietly. And that is adharma. It allows us to stabilize the mind in meditation, among other things, and it just represents stillness, right? And that's what we do in meditation. Number 5, akasha. You may have heard this word before. It means space. So if there are embodied souls, okay, the jiva is embodied in pudgala, that move and rest, there has to be a space in which all of this can happen. And this is indeed what akasha is. It is the space in which the body or bodies are emplaced and in which the jivas are able to act through those bodies, right? And it's the only of these 5 dravyas that penetrates in the Loka, so the Loka that we looked at before, and outside the Loka. So space is everywhere. It's eternal and it's infinite, right? We are inside the Loka, but space penetrates in and out. It's everywhere, okay? So if you look at the last 2 bullet points here, just as a reminder, the body, any body, my body, animal body, plant body, so on and so forth, is a collection of atoms, pudgala, through which my soul, jiva, acts in space according to its past karma. The goal is, of course, to eliminate all that karma, but embodiment happens, as you see in the last bullet point, because of our karma, both from prior lives and this life. Embodiment occurs in the Jain tradition according to a very specific hierarchy of life. These are often referred to as jati, as you see in the image to the right, the 5 classes of beings. Okay, and it goes by senses. There are 5 senses, and there are 5 different ways you can be embodied, or 5 different types of embodiment you could have depending on your karma. The first is one-sensed, which could be the plants, the elements, right? And things known as nigoda. So these are like the smallest microorganisms. Think sometimes Jains will refer to these as bacteria or other things like that, the smallest microorganisms. Those are one-sensed beings. Then there are two-sensed beings, as you see to the right, that have touch and taste. So one-sense beings can only touch, right? They have a sense of touch. Two-sense beings have touch and taste. This could be like worms, as you see to the right, shellfish or something like that. Three-sense beings, which have touch, taste, and smell. Ants, for example, as you see in the image to the right. Four-sense beings, which have touch, taste, smell, and sight. So maybe a fly. Five-sense beings, finally, which have touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. This could be, you could be born as a hell being and have all 5 of these senses. You could be born as a god and have all 5 of these senses. You could be born as an animal and you'd have all 5 of these senses. Most importantly, in the Jain tradition, you could be born as a human with all 5 of these senses, therefore able to comprehend all of reality and eventually achieve liberation. And it is only by being born as a human that one can achieve liberation in the Jain tradition, because we have the capacity as humans in this embodiment to recognize and study this embodiment or this hierarchy of life that leads to embodiment, to limit our consumption, what we eat and what we interact with, to the one-sensed beings. Okay, so that's why Jains are vegetarians and increasingly vegans, because they're only eating the one-sensed beings. And eventually, as a result of that, as a result of our philosophical reflection and correct behavior and perfection of nonviolence, achieve liberation. No one else can do that. A god cannot even achieve liberation, right? Animals can't. They can have a wake up and then be born into another life, as Mahavira did. He was a lion in a prior life who realized that he was being violent and stopped killing and starved to death, right? Which eventually led to a human birth, and he was liberated. Hell beings have to work through all their karma in hell. Gods get to live out their great karma up in heaven for a while, but they always end up falling back down, right? Either down into the hell being realm, animal realm, or into the human realm. But it's in the human realm that we have an opportunity to really burn our karma and realize, as you see in the last bullet point, that nothing wants to be harmed. None of these other sensed beings, not even plants, but really none of these beings want to be harmed. Perfect nonviolence and realize Jainism's claim in our own experience of universal compassion. So that's the purpose of this embodiment, or this hierarchy of life, describing embodiment, is to show us that there's all these forms of life that don't want to feel pain, and ultimately we can only eat those that come out of the first, which are plants, essentially plants. Okay, so we've looked at the ontological categories, and we've looked at the embodiment of life within the Jain cosmology. Now we're going to look at the Loka as the structure of heavens and hells. Okay, so if those 5 ontological categories are the first way that the Loka is described, the second way that the word Loka is used is through the structure of heavens and hells. So this is the Loka. You're looking at the Loka, right? This picture was taken by a friend of mine when I went to the International School for Jain Studies in 2012. Stephanie, whose name you see down here at the bottom of the for the image source for both of these images, took both of these pictures, and what you see here is us entering into an elevator. There's an elevator door at the bottom of this Loka. This is located in Hastinapur in India. So we're in North India, and there's a great Jain display of the cosmos in this place, right? And there's a great teacher, Mataji, who teaches. She's a Jain nun who teaches Jain philosophy and Jain Dharma and Jain teachings there. So we got to do a lot of interesting thing there. I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about Jainism, that you think about going to the International School for Jain Studies in the summer, or in the winter. They have programs both times, and you may be lucky enough to go into this structure, the Loka, while you're there. When you walk into the Loka, you get into an elevator, but this elevator has windows on the side, and you can actually see into the inside of the structure of this building that you're looking at from the outside. And what you see when you first go in are these images, which you see to the right. So the small image on the right, you can see here, if you look very closely, has a bunch of demons and hell beings in it. And there's also a lot of body parts laying around, and a lot of darkness and catastrophe and suffering that's taking place, right? Down in the bottom, when you get into the elevator, you've entered into what is known as a series of darker and darker hells that are inhabited, as you see here above the image, by hell beings who suffer due to all the awful things they did in a prior life. So they're living out all their awful karma for things that they've done in the past that were not so great, right? And the purpose of this is to show you as a visitor, but also Jains, how reality is structured according to the Jain tradition. So you get into that bottom piece of the elevator, you look around, and it's actually quite horrifying, right? You think, I don't ever want to go here, so I'm going to try to burn my karma in this lifetime because this looks terrible. Or at least do good things so I stay up in the upper realms. And that's exactly what happens next. You go from the bottom of the elevator up, and you start going up, and you start to ascend through a series of hells, right? At the bottom is the worst hell, but the hells get a little bit nicer as you go up. There aren't as many body parts and so on and so forth, until finally, right above hell is the world where we live, the human world. And you see people living as they do here, as we live our householder lives, in that very center space, the skinniest space in the middle of the Loka here, okay? From there, the elevator continues to go up, and you start to see some really nice things. A lot of people who had a lot of really good karma were born into the celestial realms, okay? You see to the right here, it is a series of brighter and brighter heavens inhabited by divine beings living lives of pleasure. they're eating up all the good karma from all the great things they did before in prior lives, right? Now, the important thing that I mentioned before is that even though they're up there, they can't achieve liberation, and eventually they will fall back down either to earth or below, depending on what it is that they do or what they did while they are enjoying their lives as gods. Were they helping people out, or were they just being really selfish, and so on and so forth? So you don't get to stay there forever, and then you have to come back down. And it is in this middle world, as you see to the right, where humans live, where we live. It's the only place where liberation can be attained, and you have to be a human to attain it. So that's the place to be, right? But anyway, so you go up through there and you get to see, because after you go through the celestial realms, which you think are really great, and you get to the top, you're at the top of the Loka looking down onto everything else below you. And it's that place, that's the ultimate place where a Jain's soul, or where any soul would want to go within the Jain cosmos, because it's free from suffering, it's omniscient, it sees everything, and yet it doesn't have to participate in it anymore. Rebirth has ended, and the universe, you stand at the top of the universe looking down upon it. So that's what this is, this Loka, and that's how it's structured: hells, earth, heavens, and then finally even beyond the heavens. That's where we're trying to go. As you can see from the structure here, the way it's all put together is that what holds it together is that there's the force of adharma, stasis, that doesn't let things move on the outside. And then there's the force of dharma and movement, and that is what occurs inside, like everything we're doing on the planet, including me moving my arms right now. Every bit of movement and possibility for movement, that allows for human experience or embodied experience, right? So the adharma squeezes in and the dharma kind of pushes out. Their intention with one another gives shape to this cosmic body, or Loka, this universe, which is surrounded and penetrated by akasha, space, which goes throughout both inside and outside of it. And at the bottom of which there are clouds. Okay, so there's this Loka kind of sits, as you see at the bottom, on top of some clouds. So that's the way that the Jain universe is structured and understood. And what a beautiful picture by Stephanie here, right? You see the sun above, sitting in the Loka, where those liberated souls are looking down upon all of us. Okay, so I mentioned the 5 ontological categories that you have to understand, right, before: the jiva and the ajiva. The jiva was the soul, right? And the ajiva was the pudgala, the atoms that our bodies are made out of, the dharma, the potential for motion, the adharma, the potential for stasis, and then akasha, space, which penetrates everything. Those cover number 1 and number 2 of what are known as the 9 tattvas, or reals. These are the 9 real things that the entire universe is constructed of. So number 1 and number 2, jiva and ajiva, we've already looked at. You already understand what those 2 things are, right? The soul, and then those other 4 things that cause all of experience to be possible. According to the Uttara Dhyayana, a text that lays out these 9 reals, a true Jain has to assent to or subscribe to these 9 pieces of reality. If they don't, they're not a true Jain, right? You will find these reals also within the Tattva Sutra, the text that is canonical to all Jains, but they're boiled down to 7. Number 4 and 5 are not in the text as separate reals, but they are still part of the text. Those are minor details that you don't really need to worry about right now, but I just want to explain why you're seeing 9 here instead of 7, which is what you'll find in the Tattva Sutra. So we know what number 1 and number 2 are. Number 3, asrava, okay? Asrava refers to the process of the inflow of karma to your soul. Remember, you're trying to get rid of all your karma, which is a substance that's sticking to your soul in different colors depending on the things that you do, how awful the things are that you do, right? So how might this work? Well, let's go back to the story of our men in the tree, right? So let's say the guy that has black karma, you remember him? He tore out the entire tree and he took it with him. He took all the fruit with him. That's going to cause an inflow of dark karma again. That's a really awful thing to do. He is not working towards liberation. He's working actually against himself. So more karma will stick to his soul. That's a pretty awful thing to do, right? So the inflow of karma, when he does that, when he rips the tree up, that's asrava. There's actually a physical substance that flows in towards him, right? Now, number 4 and number 5, these are the 2 that are left out as reals within the Tattva Sutra. But number 4 and number 5 refer to whether or not one's karma that's flowing into them is meritorious or unmeritorious. Okay? Punya karma, meritorious karma, means you did something nice, right? And it feels good to do things that are nice, right? But it still requires action. It still requires us to do something. So for example, the man who had the white karma, who picked up the fruit off the ground and ate the fruit off the ground and said, I'm not going to bother the tree, that was something meritorious to do. That was good karma. He didn't hurt the tree. He took only what he needed. And yet it was still action. It was still an attachment. He still had to eat something. He still had to move his body. That still causes an inflow, asrava, of karma, okay, that eventually will need to be eliminated. And so, for example, some Jains, not all Jains, not a lot of Jains, but some Jains, especially monks and nuns, will in fact starve themselves to death at the end of life to give up even the need to eat, right, to burn away some more of that karma, for example. Okay, so punya karma is good. It'll maybe make you born into the celestial realms at some point, but ultimately that has to go away too for you to be liberated. Number 5, papa karma is exactly the opposite. It is unmeritorious karma. Papa karma is the kind of karma, for example, that the man who ripped the whole tree out by its trunk out of the ground is going to cause to inflow towards his soul, right? So asrava, the inflow of karma, can happen one of two ways. You can either get good karma, which will maybe make you born as a better human, or as a monk or a nun, or even a celestial being in the future, or papa karma, which is going to further bind your soul in darkness and maybe give you a worse rebirth in the future. Number 6, bandha, is the process through which that karma that's flowing into you binds to your soul, right? So karma flows in as either punya or papa, meritorious or unmeritorious, and then it binds to your soul, bandha, binding, right? So this is just describing the process of karma, essentially, right? Now, at some point, most people have a moment in their life, I hope, where they realize that they reflect on the things that they're doing, the way that they're living their life, right? Not just Jains, but everybody, right? We've all probably had this, whether it's in relationships, the way we relate to the world, the way we relate to animals, the way we relate to nature. We have a wake up where we realize the things that we are doing need to be modified, need to change, right? So let's just assume for a minute that that guy that pulled out the trunk, who has the really dark karma, something at some point wakes him up where he realizes, gosh, I didn't need to take the whole tree. Maybe he saw the man who picked up the fruit off the ground and went, wow, he got to have that fruit. He didn't have to tear up the whole tree. The tree will be here for other people in the future. Maybe something in his little tiny heart just cracks open and he realizes, I got to change the way I'm living my life. This is not good for the environment. It's not good for the tree. It's not good for other people, right? So he decides, I'm going to stop behaving the way I'm behaving. And I'm going to start acting and following the way that this person who has the white karma is behaving, right? I'm going to try to eliminate all of my karma, or at least get it down to the smallest amount possible so I have a better rebirth and eventually can achieve liberation. Well, this desire and process of stopping the inflow of karma is known as samvara. Number 7, samvara. So you're going to actually be conscious about how you're causing karma to flow into your body, and you're going to stop it. Okay, so he's going to stop doing those really awful things to begin, and then the karma will eventually, if he does it long enough, it will start to burn away. Okay, and that is number 8, nirjara, the destruction of bound karma. So the karma that was on his soul already, that black karma, not only will karma stop flowing into his body, at least the bad karma, but he's also going to destroy through his austerity, through his relinquishment of destructive activities, even though it gives him great pleasure to rip that tree out of the ground. By stopping and reflecting on what he's doing and causing himself discomfort in stopping these bad habits, it's hard to stop a bad habit, right? He is going to destroy all the karma that is bound to his soul, or at least some of it. That is the process of nirjara. Now imagine this whole entire process, right, is happening to free the soul, right? Number 1. It's happening within a body and space, number 2, ajiva, right? And this is the whole process through which karma comes to our soul and is destroyed from our soul. We need to enact the process of nirjara ultimately to all of our karma. And that is why monks and nuns live lives of extreme asceticism, as we've seen, the most extreme in the Digambara sect, but also even in the Shvetamrita sect. They live very difficult lives of non-possession, non-violence, celibacy, and so on and so forth, but with a spiritual purpose. They're trying to destroy all of the karma that has been bound to their soul, to stop any new karma from coming in, and ultimately, as you see in number 9, achieve moksha, or liberation, or what Dundas refers to as deliverance, delivering the soul from this loka up. So it will go up, and as you see in the picture to the right here, sit at the top of the loka, looking down, omniscient forever and ever. The other word for moksha or liberation again is kevala. And if you are a kevalin, one of the people that you see sitting up here at the top of the loka, if you are a kevalin, you are one who is possessed of the quality of liberation. Your soul is done. It's up there. It doesn't have to ever come back ever again. Very hard thing to do, but worth trying. So these are the 9 tattvas to which every Jain, in the process that every Jain has to ascribe if they're a quote unquote true Jain. Very important to know. So now we're going to go into a little bit of nuance for how this process works. Karma bandha, as you'll recall back here, number 6, the binding of karma bandha. How it actually occurs, this binding of karma to the soul, is never fully explained in Jain literature, as Dundas points out. However, he gives a couple of points of philosophers who attempted to explain how it works. The first one that we can probably relate to is from Akalanka, who says that the jiva, our soul, experiences passions. It wants things, right? It's attracted to things. And as a result, attracts karma to itself that sticks to it like a damp cloth that attracts dust. Have you ever been on a hike and your pants get wet, like down by your shoes because it's raining, or you step in a puddle, and then as you're hiking, the dust that you kick up starts to accumulate around the bottom of your pant leg and stick to and become muddy with the water? Something like that, right? The soul is like the cloth or the material that gets wet, and it becomes damp, and it attracts dust to it simply due to the fact that it's wet and it sticks, right? So that's how the jiva is explained by Akalanka to actually be attracting these karmic particles. It's something like that. And you see a nice image here from Ravindra Jain's book, Gyan Mukta, of the soul standing there in the middle, attracting all these different colored karmic particles to itself as its passions are being enacted, or it's having desires, or it's acting out things in the world that are causing karma of various sorts to attach to its soul. Now, this picture could also represent the soul burning the karma away, and it's flying away, right? It's burning off due to the austerities, the tapas, the heat from fasting, and all the things you give up. So that's how Akalanka explains the process of karma. And then Umasvati, the author of the Tattvartha Sutra, the text that we've been looking at here and considering that it's canonical to all Jains, says that karma flows from what are known as kshaya, right? The kshayas can happen in thought, word, or deed. Kshaya itself can mean stickiness, and they are the following 4 things: one's anger, one's pride, one's deception, deceiving others, or one's greed. So if you have any of these sticky thoughts or words or deeds, you are going to attract karma to your soul as a result, right? So you can see that getting rid of these basic human qualities that we often see as kind of like gross and we don't want to have them, that we all have, it can be a very difficult thing, right? So karma binds as a result of these things, and our goal is to get rid of them, all these egoic tendencies in thought, word, and deed. Now, there is an exception to all this, and there's always an exception to everything. In this introductory series, I'm trying to just give you an overview of how some of the basic Jain doctrines work, but there's always an exception, right? And we've talked about Kunda Kunda before. So here's Kunda Kunda again. He was a Digambara around the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, and he established a very important group known as the Mula Sangha. We'll look more at the Mula Sangha in the future, but a predominant Digambara sect tying itself back to the authority of Mahavira. And one of Kunda Kunda's books is here to the right. That's where that image comes of the soul sitting in the middle of the body, right? And why is that? Why is it focusing on the jiva? Well, for Kunda Kunda, the jiva was the only ultimate category of existence, right? So remember we saw all those other categories? the 9 reals, the five basic ontological categories, the dravyas. The jiva is one of those. It's the first one. But for kunda kunda, that's the only one that matters, right? Forget about all the others that I just explained to you. For kunda kunda, this is a deeply mystical process, the process of liberation and getting to know the self and having self-knowledge and liberating the soul. It's deeply mystical. You are to focus only on the self. You don't really need to do anything else, right? So it's kind of getting rid of this idea that you have to understand this whole complicated structure of reality. Just know your higher self. Get to know your higher self. According to Kunda Kunda, our higher self, the jiva, loses its awareness of pure knowledge because it has that pure omniscience that knows everything, right? And liberated nature. It's inherently liberated. All we have to do is realize that it's inherently liberated. And this is where the exception to karma comes up, because according to Kunda Kunda, austerities, right, the practice of fasting and giving up all those human emotions and so on and so forth, have no real bearing on the soul. The soul is already free. We just have to realize it, right? And so according to Dundas, this is deeply subversive, right? Because the Jain tradition is extremely austere, extremely obsessed with burning karma through our practice, through spiritual practices that are very difficult, right? Which may even lead up to starving oneself to death, right? So for Kunda Kunda, those things might not necessarily be relevant. Though interestingly, and I'll end with this slide with this, elsewhere, outside of the text where he's making these claims, Kunda Kunda does seem to condone certain forms of asceticism for the practice of the Jain in the Jain tradition. So he doesn't completely write it off, although he's opening up the door and the possibility of having self-knowledge, self-awareness of the jiva, or liberation of the jiva, without having to participate in these really difficult practices. So what happens? Well, if you do burn all your karma, right? If you're following the idea of karma and the idea that karma can bind in your life and to your soul, you're trying to achieve moksha by releasing it from all of its karma, as we said before, right? Nevertheless, even after one achieves liberation, moksha or kevala, in this lifetime, there are 4 karmas that remain operative during your life, because you don't die necessarily when you achieve liberation, depending on which sector you're in and so on and so forth. You don't necessarily die when you achieve liberation. You're liberated while living in the body. So your body is still here, but your soul is free, right? So there are 4 karmas that remain operative during the rest of your life, the kevalin's life, that person who's possessed of liberation, such as, for example, your lifespan, right? Your lifespan was predetermined when you were born according to past karmas. And so that non-harming karma, it's called a non-harming karma, will continue to last out. So if you were born to live, say, 90 years, and you got liberated when you were, 40 years old, you still have another 50 years to live. That's a non-harming karma that won't go away, right? And you'll just live out for those other 40 years, teaching others because you're liberated and so forth, right? And what's interesting about this, and what Dundas points out in bullet point number 3 here, is that after you achieve that liberation, any new karma that might come to your body because you have to eat to feed your body, for example, eat some basic food, walk a little bit to use the restroom, whatever it is, any new karma that you receive is instantly burned, because your austerities, the fire within you, is so strong that any inflow of karma will not bind to your soul. It will instantly evaporate, right? Because you're a liberated one. That's kind of a cool way for understanding how you can be liberated in this lifetime, and you don't have to die as a result, or you don't have to leave the world as a result. You're still an embodied soul, but you're completely free of all karma. It's all burned away, right? And this is the last bullet point points out here. Not everyone, and hardly anyone really, is going to be capable of karma, right? So you can either be capable in this lifetime of karma based on your propensity for spiritual life and so forth. That's bhavya, you're capable. Or you can be incapable of bhavya, of moksha, right? So you're either capable of burning away all your karma or not in this lifetime. Maybe you have so much awful karma that it's just not going to happen in this lifetime, right? But if you're one of the few lucky, right, and it may not even happen in this fallen world age that we're in right now. Remember, we're in that of a Sarpani, we're in like the 5th world stage and things were really bad. It may not happen now, but if you continue to accrue that meritorious karma and get born into good lives over and over and over again, maybe one day your soul will ascend to the top of the Loka, as you see here pictured to the right. Otherwise, like most of us, you'll be reborn and transmigrate. Your soul will be reborn and transmigrate into life after life after life, right? The jiva, our soul, will reincarnate. And in the Jain tradition, which is different from the Hindu tradition, the jiva reincarnates instantly, right? So there's no delay. Or like in Buddhism, where you can go through the bardo, right? And you can, in Tibetan Buddhism, you have, 49 days or something like that of traveling through that liminal space before you're reincarnated into something else. No, in Jainism, the jiva reincarnates instantaneously. Boom, you die, you're reborn, or you enter another embryo somewhere else, right? So it's important to know, and this is important in Hinduism too, but it's really important in the Jain tradition. Your mental state at the time of your death is important, right? You recall the story of Parshva, when Parshva, the 23rd Tirthankara, rescued the snakes from the burning fire. He walked up to them as they were dying, and he said, "Look, you're about to die right now. You're almost burned to death. I tried to rescue you, but you're going to die. But don't be angry at the person who accidentally burned you and didn't care that you were burning. Don't be angry, because if you're angry, it's not going to lead to a good future rebirth. Die in peace, die quietly, without the anger, and you will be born into a better life." And certainly they were. They were reborn as the king and queen of the snake kingdom, right? So the mental state at death is extremely important, as well as you see in bullet point number 2, the last 6 months of one's life and how one lives and conducts oneself during that life is also extremely important, right? The goal ultimately is to become enlightened, experience moksha, and to escape rebirth. But as you can see to the image to the right, there are a lot of other possibilities, and most of the time this is what's going to happen. You can be born in the infernal kingdom, in the hell, but you see the hell being, somebody's in fire being tortured there, right? So that was at the lower level of the Loka, where that elevator starts, right? Really awful place if you did a lot of awful things. Number 2, you could be born into the animal and plant kingdom, right? So one step above in terms of intensity. Number 3, you're hoping to be born into the human kingdom, right? Either as a Jain again, with a good life, where you can continue to work towards progress of liberation, or as a Tirthankara, or not necessarily Tirthankara, but as a monk or nun, so that you can achieve liberation, be supported in that process by the lay people, the householders. Or number 4, into the celestial kingdom, where you'll become a god or goddess, and you'll get to live out some of those nice karmas that you've accrued. But eventually you'll have to come back down, because it is only through the human kingdom, the human realm, that one can achieve liberation. So there's been a lot of information in this lecture, a lot of important information about the way that Jains understand the structure of reality, the way that they understand karma, and the way that they understand that karma can be burned and one can ultimately be liberated or reborn. Take some time to reflect on this. Get a copy of the Tattva Sutra. Read it carefully. And I really look forward to seeing you again in the next lecture. Thank you.